gavel struck the block, sealing the fate of the most powerful woman in England. Stripped of her title and draped in rags, the Duchess of Alden was sold to the man who once swore to ruin her. But he didn't buy her to break her. He bought her to start a war. The year was 1794, and the air inside the subterranean vaults beneath the Fleet prison reeked of damp stone, cheap gin, and the suffocating perfume of corrupt men. This was not a place where the sun ever shone, nor was it a place where the law of King George III held any true sway. It was the Devil's Exchange, a black market auction where the ruined aristocracy were quietly disposed of, their debts bought and sold like cattle. At the center of the cavernous room stood a raised wooden block, the wood stained dark with the miseries of those who had stood there before. And tonight the prize was unparalleled. Lady Victoria Penhaligon, the Duchess of Alden, stood on the block, her wrists bound by heavy iron cuffs. A month prior she had been one of the wealthiest landowners in the British Empire, commanding vast estates across Cornwall and holding the ear of the Prime Minister, William Pitt. She was a woman who navigated the treacherous waters of Parliament with a diamond-sharp intellect, outmaneuvering lords and earls who believed a woman had no place managing a duchy. But her brilliance had bred dangerous enemies. The most lethal among them was her own flesh and blood, her uncle, Lord Thomas Penhaligon. Consumed by envy and drowning in gambling debts, Thomas had orchestrated a betrayal so intricate it belonged in a theatre tragedy. Capitalizing on the political paranoia bleeding over from the Reign of Terror in France, Thomas forged a series of damning letters. These documents falsely prove that Victoria was funneling gold to French Jacobin spies plotting treason against the crown. With the help of a corrupt magistrate, Sir Reginald Fife, the trap was sprung. Victoria's estates were seized under an archaic Act of Attainder, her assets frozen and her titles suspended. Through a twisted exploitation of the Debtors' Incarceration Act, she was legally classified as a bankrupt ward of the state to pay off the debts her uncle had secretly amassed in her name. Her indenture was brought to the underground auction. The crowd of masked aristocrats pressed closer to the block, their eyes gleaming with malicious delight. Men who had once bowed to her at royal galas now sneered at the hem of her soiled, torn linen dress. Victoria did not weep. She stood rigidly straight, her chin tilted upward, her piercing blue eyes locking onto the cowards who hid behind velvet masks. If she was to be sold into servitude, she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing the Duchess of Alden break. Bartholomew Sykes, an oily man with a powdered wig that had seen better decades, slammed his cane against the floor. "Gentlemen, we have a rare delicacy tonight. A fallen titan, Lady Victoria, formerly of Alden. Her indentures for life, her debts absolute. What am I bid for the exclusive right to own the pride of Cornwall?" £50, shouted a voice from the back. 100, cried another. Viscount Whitmore, a notoriously cruel man whose advances Victoria had publicly rejected 2 years prior, stepped forward. He lowered his mask just enough for her to see his rotting teeth. £500, he sneered. She'll make an excellent scullery maid. Or perhaps something more entertaining. Laughter echoed through the damp vault. Victoria's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of flawless marble. £500 was an exorbitant sum for a debtor's auction. Sykes raised his gavel, a greasy smile stretching across his face. £500, going once, going twice, £10,000. The voice cut through the clamour like a scythe through dry wheat. It was not shouted, it was spoken with a quiet, lethal authority that instantly suffocated the laughter in the room. The crowd parted as if repelled by an unseen force. Stepping out from the shadows of the archway was Tristan Montgomery, the Duke of Rothbury. A collective gasp swept through the room. Tristan was a man feared equally in the salons of Mayfair and the back alleys of London. Tall, broad-shouldered and dressed in immaculate, stark black tailoring, He possessed a reputation forged in ruthlessness. 10 years ago, Victoria's father had publicly ruined Tristan's family, exposing a scandal that sent the previous Duke of Rothbury to an early disgraced grave. Tristan had rebuilt his fortune in the unforgiving trade routes of the East India Company, returning to England a billionaire with a heart rumored to be made of ice. Society whispered that he lived only for vengeance against the House of Alden. Whitmore paled, taking a step back. Rothbury? You must be mad. £10,000 is a king's ransom. Tristan did not even glance at the Viscount. His dark, impenetrable eyes were fixed entirely on Victoria. He walked slowly to the base of the auction block. The proximity of him sent a shiver down Victoria's spine. She braced herself for the cruelty she was certain he would inflict. He had waited a decade for this moment, the ultimate revenge against the family that had destroyed his own. £10,000, Tristan repeated softly, his gaze locked with hers. And I will pay it in pure gold. Conclude the sale, Sykes, before I lose my patience. Sykes swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he brought the gavel down with a sharp crack. Sold. To the Duke of Rothbury. As the iron cuffs were unlocked from the post and Tristan's men stepped forward to claim her, Victoria felt the true weight of her ruin. She had survived the fall from grace, but she was entirely certain she would not survive the Duke of Rothbury. The carriage ride north was a suffocating torment. For 3 days, rain lashed against the windows of Tristan's lacquered coach as it thundered toward Northumberland. Inside, the silence was absolute. Victoria sat shivering in the corner, the thin linen of her dress offering no protection against the biting autumn chill. Tristan sat opposite her, an ocean of distance between them despite the cramped quarters. He spent the journey entirely absorbed in a thick, leather-bound ledger, the scratching of his quill the only sound competing with the storm outside. He hadn't gloated. He hadn't spoken a single word to her since the auction. On the second night, as the temperature plummeted, Victoria could no longer suppress a violent shiver. Tristan's quill stopped. He didn't look up, but he reached beside him, lifted his heavy, fur-lined wool driving coat and tossed it across the carriage. It landed squarely in her lap, engulfing her in warmth and the faint scent of sandalwood and pipe smoke. "Wear it," he murmured, his eyes returning to his ledger. "I have no use for a frozen asset." Victoria gritted her teeth, pride warring with hypothermia. Survival won. She pulled the massive coat around her shoulders, staring at his impassive face. What is his game? She wondered desperately. They arrived at Rothbury Hall at midnight. It was not a manor, it was a fortress of black stone perched on a jagged cliff overlooking the restless North Sea. Victoria prepared herself to be thrown into a cellar or dragged to the servants' quarters. Instead, she was greeted by the head housekeeper, a stern but gentle-eyed woman named Mrs. Higgins. Without a word from Tristan, who immediately vanished into the West Wing, Victoria was escorted upstairs. She was not taken to a cell, but to the grandest suite in the house. A roaring fire was already lit. A brass tub filled with steaming water and scented oils awaited her. On the bed lay a wardrobe of exquisite silk gowns tailored precisely to her measurements. Victoria stood in the center of the opulent room, utterly bewildered. This was not the treatment of a slave, nor the vengeance of a bitter rival. For a week she lived in luxurious isolation. She was fed rich foods, allowed to roam the vast gardens, and treated with utmost deference by the star. Yet she was a prisoner. The heavy iron gates of the estate were guarded, and Tristan was a ghost, avoiding her entirely. By the 8th night, the suspense became intolerable. Victoria waited until the great clock chimed 2 in the morning, slipped out of her chambers, and navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the manor toward the West Wing. She found the heavy oak doors of Tristan's library slightly ajar, spilling golden lamplight into the dark hallway. She pushed the door open. Tristan was seated behind a massive mahogany desk, his cravat undone, looking exhausted. Spread across his desk were dozens of documents, maps, and wax-sealed letters. "I assumed it would take you a week to lose your patience," Tristan said without looking up, his pen scratching across a parchment. Victoria stepped into the room, her chin raised in the familiar, imperious angle of a duchess. "I demand to know what you are doing, Your Grace. If you intend to torture me, do it. If you intend to use me as a scullery maid, hand me a brush. But I will not be kept as a pampered pet in a gilded cage while my uncle dismantles my legacy." Tristan finally looked up. The cold, unfeeling mask he wore in public was gone, replaced by a storm of raw, simmering intensity. He stood, his imposing frame dominating the room, and walked around the desk to face her. "Do you truly believe I spent £10,000 to have you polish my silver, Victoria?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. It was the first time he had used her Christian name. "You spent it for revenge," she countered, refusing to back down. "My father ruined yours. You bought me to humiliate the House of Alden." Tristan let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "Your father exposed a truth my father was too weak to hide. I harbor no ill will for a man acting to protect the crown. My vengeance is reserved for those who actually deserve it." He gestured toward the chaotic spread of documents on his desk. "Come here. Look at these." Hesitantly, Victoria stepped forward, her breath caught in her throat. There, meticulously organized, were the exact replicas of the forged letters her uncle had used to frame her, alongside shipping manifests, bank transfers, and intercepted correspondence from France. "Thomas Penhaligon is liquidating the Alden estates," Tristan explained, his tone shifting to sharp, tactical precision. "He is selling the tin mines in Cornwall to a French syndicate, the same syndicate funding the Jacobin armies. Your uncle isn't just a thief, Victoria. He is committing high treason against England." Victoria stared at the papers, her mind reeling. "But why buy me? Why not take this to the Prime Minister?" "Because Thomas is clever," Tristan replied, stepping closer. "He structured your downfall so that the Crown legally absorbed your debts, which he then bought through a proxy. As long as you were a debtor to the state, he controlled the Alden proxy. By purchasing your indenture at that auction, I didn't just buy your freedom. I legally acquired the primary debt of the House of Alden." He stopped mere inches from her. The scent of sandalwood surrounded her again. "I hold the financial leash to your uncle's neck, and I have spent the last week gathering the final pieces of proof needed to present to the House of Lords. We have him, Victoria." She looked up into his dark eyes, realizing the staggering magnitude of what he had done. He hadn't ruined her. He had built a fortress around her while he dismantled her enemies. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling for the first time. "Why would you risk your standing, your fortune for me?" Tristan's gaze softened, a vulnerability flashing in his eyes that made Victoria's heart stutter. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn velvet box. He placed it in her hands. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Resting on the dark velvet was the Alden signet ring, a massive, ancient sapphire carved with a falcon. It had been stripped from her finger the night she was arrested. "It took me a month to track down the pawnbroker Thomas sold it to," Tristan said quietly. "Then the Duke of Rothbury, the most feared man in London, the man who bowed to no one, stepped back and lowered himself to one knee." Victoria gasped, taking a step back. "Tristan," he looked up at her, not with submission but with fierce, unwavering devotion. "I bought the ruined Duchess of Alden," he said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty, "only so I could kneel and place her crown back where it belongs." He reached up, taking her trembling hand, and slid the heavy sapphire ring back onto her finger. "You are Lady Victoria Penhaligon," he vowed, pressing a slow, searing kiss to her knuckles. "And tomorrow we ride for London to take back your empire." The journey back to London was not the quiet, suffocating ordeal the trip north had been. Inside the Duke of Rothbury's lacquered coach, the air crackled with a dangerous electric anticipation. Victoria Penhaligon, once a ruined debtor, was now armed with the devastating truth of her uncle's treason. Beside her sat Tristan Montgomery, a man who had transformed from her family's greatest nemesis into a most formidable shield. As the carriage thundered through the desolate stretches of the Yorkshire moors, the relentless rain finally broke, giving way to a freezing, fog-choked twilight. Victoria traced the heavy sapphire of her family's signet ring with her thumb, her mind racing through the upcoming confrontation. "Thomas will not surrender quietly," Victoria said, breaking the comfortable silence. "He has Prime Minister William Pitt's ear. He has woven this lie of my Jacobin sympathy so deeply into the fabric of Whitehall that simply presenting letters may not be enough. He will claim they are your forgeries, Tristan. He will claim you orchestrated this out of your vendetta against the Alden name." Tristan did not look up from the flintlock pistol he was meticulously loading. "Let him claim what he wishes. I do not rely on parchment alone, Victoria. I rely on the greed of men." He snapped the mechanism shut and handed the heavy weapon to her. "Keep this loaded. Thomas knows I purchased your debt. Sykes is a gossip. The news will have reached London by now. Your uncle will realize his proxy control over the Alden fortune is slipping." As if summoned by his words, a sharp echoing crack split the evening air. The carriage lurched violently, throwing Victoria against Tristan's chest. The agonizing scream of a horse tore through the fog, followed by the frantic shouting of Tristan's outriders. The coach skidded to a violent halt, the wooden wheels groaning against the muddy road. "Highwaymen," Victoria gasped, righting herself and gripping the pistol. "Assassins," Tristan corrected, his voice dangerously calm. He drew a pair of dueling pistols from his coat. "Thomas sent them. He intends to ensure neither you nor the debt ever reach Parliament." Tristan kicked the carriage door open just as a masked rider brought a heavy saber down toward the window. With terrifying precision, Tristan fired. The rider was thrown backward into the mist. "Stay down," he ordered Victoria, leaping from the carriage into the fray. The fog was thick, but the flashes of musket fire illuminated the brutal skirmish. Tristan's guards were highly trained East India Company veterans, but the ambushers outnumbered them. Victoria watched through the shattered window as a large man in a heavy wool coat managed to slip past the guards, raising a blunderbuss and aiming it squarely at Tristan's unprotected back. Instinct overrode fear. Victoria shattered the remaining glass with the barrel of her flintlock, leveled her arm just as her father had taught her on the Cornwall ranges, and pulled the trigger. The recoil bruised her wrist, but the shot rang true. The assassin dropped his weapon, clutching his shoulder as he collapsed into the mud. Tristan spun around at the noise, his eyes locking onto Victoria, who was still holding the smoking pistol. A fierce, predatory grin touched the corners of the Duke's mouth. Within minutes, the remaining attackers fled into the moors. Tristan dragged the wounded man Victoria had shot toward the carriage, ripping the mask from his face. It was one of Sir Reginald Fife's personal enforcers. "It seems," Tristan said, looking up at Victoria with dark, blazing admiration, "that your uncle's desperation has just provided us with our star witness." 3 days later, the scene shifted to the opulent, suffocating corridors of the Palace of Westminster. The House of Lords was in a private committee session. At the head of the heavy oak table sat William Pitt the Younger, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, looking pale and burdened by the ever-looming threats of the French Revolutionary Wars. Standing before him, oozing false melancholy, was Lord Thomas Penhaligon. "It breaks my heart, Prime Minister," Thomas said, dabbing his eyes with a lace handkerchief. "My niece was a brilliant woman, but her mind was poisoned by French radicalism. She funneled the wealth of Cornwall to our enemies. As the newly appointed steward of the Alden Trust, and to satisfy the debts she incurred against the Crown, I have negotiated the sale of the coastal tin mines to a neutral Dutch consortium. The funds will reimburse the Treasury immediately." William Pitt sighed, adjusting his spectacles. "A tragic affair, Penhaligon. But the Crown appreciates your swift action in recovering the stolen assets. Pass me the deed of dissolution. I shall sign the royal assent." Thomas's eyes gleamed with triumphant greed as he slid the heavy parchment across the table. Pitt dipped his quill into the inkwell. "I would strongly advise against signing that document, Prime Minister, unless you wish to be an accessory to high treason." The heavy double doors of the chamber were thrown open so violently they cracked against the marble walls. The room erupted into gasps. Standing in the threshold was the Duke of Rothbury, clad in immaculate, severe black velvet, looking every inch the ruthless conqueror society feared. But it was not Tristan who drew the horrified stares of the assembled lords. It was the woman on his arm. Lady Victoria Penhaligon stepped into the chamber. She was not the ragged, broken woman sold in the Fleet prison vaults. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk, her dark hair swept up in an intricate crown of braids woven with diamonds. On her hand, catching the candlelight, flashed the massive sapphire of the Alden signet. She looked like a queen returning to reclaim a usurped throne. Thomas Penhaligon turned the color of chalk. He shrieked, his composure shattering instantly. "Seize her. She is an attainted traitor and a runaway debtor." "She is the Duchess of Alden." Tristan's voice boomed, silencing the room. He strode forward, guiding Victoria to the center of the chamber. "And as of 2 weeks ago, she is no longer a debtor to the Crown. I purchased her indenture in full. I hold the Alden debt. Therefore, Lord Penhaligon's proxy over the estate is entirely null and void." William Pitt stood up, his quill snapping in his grip. "Rothbury, what is the meaning of this intrusion? Lady Victoria is convicted of treason. She was framed." Prime Minister Victoria spoke for herself, her voice ringing clear and authoritative across the silent room. She stepped away from Tristan, confronting Pitt directly. "Framed by a man who is currently attempting to sell English soil to the very French syndicate he accused me of funding." The chamber erupted into absolute chaos. Lords shouted over one another, slamming their fists on the mahogany tables. "Slander!" Thomas roared, spittle flying from his lips. He pointed a trembling finger at Victoria. "She is a desperate, ruined woman spinning lies. Prime Minister, she forged documents to save her own neck." Tristan stepped forward, signaling his men at the door. 2 burly guards hauled a battered, terrified man into the room. It was Sir Reginald Fife, the corrupt magistrate. He fell to his knees before the Prime Minister, weeping uncontrollably. "Fife?" Pitt demanded, his brow furrowed in utter confusion. "What is this?" "I have the true financial ledgers, Prime Minister," Tristan announced, tossing a heavy leather-bound book onto the table directly over the deed of dissolution. "Procured from Sir Reginald's private safe. They detail every bribe Lord Penhaligon paid to fabricate the treason charges against his niece. Furthermore, the neutral Dutch consortium Penhaligon is attempting to sell the mines to is a shell company. The gold originates from the Jacobin National Convention in Paris." Tristan leaned over the table, his dark eyes locking onto Thomas, who was now trembling violently. "You weren't just stealing your niece's fortune, Thomas. You were arming the French fleet." William Pitt frantically opened the ledger, his eyes scanning the detailed entries, the dates, the matching sums of gold. He looked at the weeping magistrate. "Is this true, Sir Reginald?" "He forced me," Fife sobbed, pointing at Thomas. "Penhaligon threatened my family. He said the Duchess was too powerful, that she had to be removed." Thomas lunged for the door, abandoning all pretense of innocence. But Tristan was faster. The Duke moved with the lethal speed of a predator, catching Thomas by the collar of his coat and slamming him brutally against the oak wall. "You belong in the tower, you pathetic worm," Tristan whispered. his forearm pressed against Thomas's throat. "Guards! Guards!" Pitt shouted, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Arrest Lord Penhaligon and Sir Reginald Fife. Hold them in the Tower of London without bail, pending trial for high treason against the Crown." As the King's guards dragged her screaming uncle from the chamber, Victoria felt a decade of weight lift from her shoulders. She had won. Her name, her legacy, her empire, it was all hers again. William Pitt walked around the table, his expression one of profound remorse. He stopped before Victoria and offered a deep, formal bow. "Your Grace, the Crown owes you an apology of the highest magnitude. The act of attainder will be reversed before the sun sets. Your titles, your lands, and your fortune are fully restored." Pitt then turned to Tristan. "And you, Rothbury, you risked your own life and fortune to untangle this web." "Why?" Tristan looked at Victoria, the coldness in his eyes melting into something profoundly warm and fiercely protective. "Because, Prime Minister, true power does not lie in destroying your enemies. It lies in protecting those who are irreplaceable." 1 month later, the grand ballroom of the Alden estate in Cornwall was ablaze with thousands of beeswax candles. The elite of London society, the very people who had gossiped about Victoria's ruin and sneered at her auction, now filled her halls, drinking her champagne and bowing as she walked past. They were desperate to win back the favor of the most powerful woman in England. But Victoria had eyes for only one man. She found Tristan standing on the stone terrace, looking out over the moonlit sea. The harshness of London had faded from him, replaced by a quiet, steady peace. She stepped out into the cool night air, the heavy silk of her emerald gown rustling against the stone. "They're terrified of you in there, you know," she murmured, stepping up beside him. Tristan chuckled softly, turning to face her. "I should hope so. I did threaten to bankrupt half the House of Lords if they ever spoke ill of you again." Victoria smiled, looking down at the Alden sapphire on her hand, and then at the man who had placed it back there. "You bought my debts, Tristan. You spent £10,000 on a ruined woman. The Crown has reimbursed you, but you still legally hold my indenture contract. You never destroyed it." Tristan reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out the folded, wax-sealed auction document. "I kept it as a reminder," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate timbre. "A reminder of the night I finally found something worth fighting for." He held the parchment over the flame of a nearby terrace lantern. The paper caught instantly, the edges curling and blackening until the chains of her past were nothing but ash scattering in the sea breeze. "You are free, Victoria," Tristan said, his dark eyes searching hers. "You have your crown, you have your empire. You need nothing and no one." "That is where you are wrong, Your Grace," Victoria whispered, stepping effortlessly into his personal space. She reached up, her hands coming to rest against the lapels of his coat. "I have my empire, but an empire requires an alliance to keep it strong." Tristan's breath hitched. He wrapped his strong arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him. "An alliance, Your Grace, or a surrender." "I surrender to no man," she said, a wicked, brilliant smile lighting up her face. "But I might be persuaded to share my throne." Tristan let out a soft groan before capturing her lips in a deep, consuming kiss. It was a kiss that tasted of victory, of shared battles, and of a love forged in the darkest of fires. He had bought the ruined Duchess at an auction, only to kneel and place her crown back on. But in doing so, he had conquered the one thing no amount of gold could buy, her heart. Did the Duke of Rothbury's ultimate revenge plot leave you speechless? If you loved this tale of betrayal, high society drama, and a romance that conquered the British Empire, don't keep this story to yourself. Hit that like button, share this video with your fellow history and romance lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life historical dramas. Drop a comment below on your favorite twist.